I literally expected Sunday morning everyone to be fast asleep at this panel. Um, Thank you everyone for being here. It's actually great to follow up on Anindyo, who's raised a set of questions that I further want to problematize in my conversation. And I will actually borrow a lot from the many conversations we've had yesterday. Uh, I am presenting a work in progress. This is part of a 20,000 word article I'm writing. So I'm going to present small snippets, but I'm hoping to further some of the conversations from yesterday today. We saw this year a certain kind of conversation. I'm also kind of preempting a conversation that we're going to have later in the day for, I think, what is for me a very important panel on prisons and trans persons. So I'm actually, the word abolition in the title is borrowing from the abolition movement for prisons in the United States. And I'm trying to think about whether it is possible to think about abolish not simply as about prisons, but actually about the industrial complex that has created certain kinds of identities. For anyone who has known me for for a few years now, I have a lot of problems with the law, which is ironic. I work for CLPR. Uh, but those conversations also have a lot of room in CLPR, which is why I'm able to work there. Um, because I learned about the law from Kafka, and that's not the best source. But in one of his most famous short stories called Before the Law, you have a petitioner come to the court who's never allowed entry into the court. The petitioner dies in place. And for me, that is symptomatic of how the law actually creates everything outside of it as a prison. You die in place, right? The person is incarcerated in place. For me, it is impossible in some sense to abolish prisons without abolishing the law. And so for me, in my struggle to kind of think about trans liberation and trans freedom, it is important that we think about a trans identity or a trans personhood outside the law. And I think it's really important because we continue to kind of think about better laws and so on and so forth, constantly forgetting, much like the queer movement did some time ago, constantly forgetting that the law constructs very particular kinds of identities, and the freedom then it places is one that can only be folded into its incarcerating impulse. So, is there an identity or a kind of personhood that can be rescued from and saved from, or is actually before the law, right? I borrow the conversation also because we saw the large one, we're witnessing one of the largest kind of movements around abolition in the United States, led by mostly black trans and black women and black feminist people. Um, and so one of my most favorite kind of filmmakers, Tourmaline, wrote on Twitter a while ago. She said, "Abolish the cop in your head." And I really want to think about the psychic investments of policing, law, and cops in our own head. And I want to think about this. And I want to think about this precisely because I think that we need to fight transphobia, but with it, we need to fight against the kind of policing the abolishing of transphobia would require, right? Because what we are seeing, as Anindya is pointing out, and there is much more of what the details of Anindya's story, is precisely that with this move towards the right has come a greater policing of trans identities. And we see this constantly with the conversations around Behrupias. We see this constantly in the conversations about fake trans people. We see this constantly about the right kind of trans and the wrong kind of trans. And so I want to step outside of that conversation. And so I'm going to actually take us between United States and India for a conversation between this transnational context, because I want to attack the two kind of central conversations on neoliberalism, and I can't do it without attacking these two countries. Um, for me, I'm going to think about of three figures that I feel are interesting to think about in this conversation. The first will be from a film in the 1990s, which some of us with English privilege would have seen, called Paris is Burning, made by Jenny Livingston. I'm going to speak about Venus Extravaganza. The second, I'm going to speak about one of the members of the National Council who's written a autobiography, and I'm going to think about an incident from her autobiography. The third, I'm going to think about the terrorist who led to the Pulse Orlando killings in the United States, Omar Mateen. and I'm trying to think about whether each of these people can tell us something about transphobia. First, Venus Extravaganza, New York, 1991. The film follows the person of color and black communities in the United States, trans communities, trans, queer communities, gender non-conforming, maybe non-binary. Those terms didn't exist then. A lot of these terms didn't exist then, but these are amazing women who Jenny Livingston, a white lesbian, follows around with a camera in order to create for us the document that leads to the production of something like Pose in our time. And it documents the story of the subterranean ball culture in New York, in which this white Latina, Venus Extravaganza, is one of the most interesting characters because she is the most upfront about her contradictions. She honestly just wants to be a white woman. And so her femininity is actually not, interestingly, about being trans. And also Venus is the only person whose death is actually part of the film. Venus dies under mysterious circumstances and found dead 4 days after in a hotel room, right? We all know that in the movie, we know that Venus is a sex worker and so on and so forth. So I want to think about Venus for a bit. So now, one of the people we love talking about when we talk about an international audience, when we talk about trans people, is Judith Butler. And Judith, many years ago, wrote an essay about Venus, in which she said, and she's talking about Venus's contradictions, etc., that the reason that Venus is killed because she denaturalizes gender. She passes as a white Latina, but she has what she calls a personal secret. And it is on the discovery of that secret which is most likely referring to her genitalia. It is on the discovery of that secret by a John, a client, that she is most likely killed, right? And so, as against that idea, Biddy Martin, who's also an amazing queer theorist, wrote that actually Judith, considering the fact, I mean, she doesn't say it because we don't talk like this to academics. We talk with lots of like jargon, citation, whatever. But I'm trying to take some liberty here. So Biddy is like, Judith, I think that it is quite likely that Venus is actually killed because she's a woman, right? Since women are also killed all the time. It is not necessary that she's only killed because she's a trans woman, right? And I want to actually think about the fact that even though the conditions of Venus's death are never revealed in the film, both Judith and Biddy have a conversation about the fact that it must be gender that has killed her. It is not possible that this person can be killed for any other reason. Gender, in some sense, totalizes any story we want to tell about Venus, right? And so it is not possible that she was meeting a lover. She talks often about her lovers in the film, that she was meeting a lover and they had a fight about, say, maybe he came back smelling of another woman, or maybe Venus wanted a pair of shoes she couldn't buy and was in a bad mood, and that Venus then maybe got angry at him and he got angry at her and something led to the other and she was killed. It must be, if it is a trans person, it must be transphobia that has killed the trans person, right? No other possibility for this person lives. So transness, in some sense, colonizes the story of the trans person, right? But to whom is the trans person only and only exclusively trans? To the transphobe. It is only the transphobe who, when sees another person, sees only their transness and cannot get over. You're opening the door, he sees you, and then he's like, oh my God, whatever. It is only in the gaze of the transphobe that our transness colonizes the body and the psyche of the trans person, the lives of the trans persons, right? For us, we are so much more than simply trans all the time, and sleeping trans, waking trans, dead trans, living trans, so on and so forth, right? So I'm actually quite interested in offering to Venus, therefore, the possibility that she was, in some sense, not killed. She may be killed as a trans woman, but maybe she wasn't killed for transphobia. And because this is very important for me, because for some years I've been trying to articulate that it is exhausting to constantly front oneself as an abject, hated human being, right? I'm tired of trans persons constantly having to deplete their joy deplete their community in order to present themselves as, and we are truly victims, so there's nothing wrong with that, but only and exclusively as victims to the law in order to access rights on those terms, right? And so, this, and in this case, it is so terrible that while Venus identifies as a white Latina, we must impose this trans story on her. So we depart from her self determined gender in order to tell the story of her murder, right? And therefore, we take on the pharma pornographic kind of complex, right? And I am quite convinced actually that Venus did not hate herself and was not convinced of her disposability. You know, the bit about trans lives in these conversations is always as if we are always living in our deaths, right? And we're always proximate to our deaths. And so any death that happens is always in some sense forefronted by our transness, right? So the conversation about trans lives matter in some sense already fronts trans death as the horizon to which we are living. And so we are almost retroactively living from our death. And in some sense, our transness is our death, right? Which is empirically in some sense true, but not in the ordinary true, right? And so for me, I take on Saidiya Hartman's suggestion that the future of abolition must first be performed on the page, that we must first write our stories as if we were already free. Because if I was to write my story as if I'm already dead, then I'm falling into the complex that I'm trying to resist. And I don't think that there is anything interesting there, right? But I also, therefore, want to suggest, secondly, and to contradict myself, that maybe we want to think of passing that which Venus does itself as an act of trans erasure, right? I'm suggesting that this relies on a particular understanding of the idea of the normative, where we, instead of thinking of the normative as one that is a statistical average that cuts across, we think of the normative as housed in some bodies and the non-normative as housed in others, right? So then, let's think about this. Transphobia comes to be located in some bodies and transness comes to be located in others, right? But if actually transphobia is, as the conversation on trans lives matter reveals us, the fundamental condition of living, that if you were to die because you are trans, then the condition of living means to refuse transness, then to refuse transness is a strategy of survival, is passing therefore both the refusal of transness and its only capacity to survive, right? Is it possible to survive in this world without, in some sense, refusing transness and therefore participating in a structure of the erasure of trans lives, right? And so I'm trying to kind of therefore give a kind of, instead of thinking about the normative as constantly just located in some cis people, I want to think about transphobia as located in all of us, if it is the normative, right? And so therefore, and I mean, Butler is actually smart enough to know this because she says that we don't always choose the terms of our subjecthood. And often we're very close to, if subjectivity and subjection, if to be a subject is both to be subjected upon as well, then power acts on all of us. And if power acts on all of us, anti-transness or transphobia acts on all of us. None of us are redeemed of it, right? So then I want to therefore, I've actually done quite well in terms of time. Surprising myself. Very good, Vikram. Okay. But so therefore, I'm actually going to move to my second case study, which is to think about, is it possible to think about transphobia also located in the trans person to problematize for us the imagination of the fighting transphobia as fighting cis people, right? And so I want to kind of think about the psychic investments in transphobia. So trans activist, let's call her Z, leading trans activist, many years ago wrote an autobiography in which she used the word hijra for herself many years before she started using other words to define herself. And in this autobiography, I want to actually think about a rather innocuous incident. But I want to also, therefore, open up desire and the erotic as a site in which transphobia might actually open, because I feel like desire is actually rife with contradiction, and it's actually a great site to unravel um, our contradictions, right? Um, so, thinking of instead of looking at just violent acts of hatred and disregard, I actually want to think about the erotic as another place where violence actually works. And so, in some sense, in conversation with what Brian was saying yesterday, right? And one of the places where exclusionary violence happens. Now, one of the the easiest study around this is those kind of ridiculous grinder profiles where there's no fats, no femmes, no sissies, and all of that, right? But I want to kind of problematize that because there again you have the cis gay normative that excludes trans persons, right? I'm actually thinking about a person, this Hijra activist, who in 2007 goes to Netherlands to attend a film festival, a transgender film festival. At the event, or after, Zed meets K, and it's love at first sight. They hold hands in the cab after the party. On their way to the after party, they stop at a canal and look wistfully at each other's eyes. However, it's cold, and Zed, in her red ghagra choli and silk dupatta, begins to shiver at the point at which K takes off his shirt and puts it on her. Oh. As they're about to kiss, K stops to ask Z if she knows who he is. At which point, Z's eyes catch a glimpse of the scars left from his top surgery. She writes, quote, I was repulsed. So K was a woman who had become a man, just as I was a man who had become a woman. The thought that I was about to make love to a woman made me shudder. K mollified me. Give it some time, he gently said. But I was furious. I felt betrayed by K's lie. I had another 3 or 4 days to while away in Amsterdam before I returned to India. I decided not to see K again. However, they did see each other a few times thereafter. There was some exchange of memories. When she came to India, there were some calls, an unexpected visit, but mostly heartbreak. Call it the power of the norms that subject us, or to be haunted by memories of that which it means to be trans. The surgeries and the scars, or as Hortense Spillers calls it, the hieroglyphics of the flesh. Trans women's relationship to masculinity. Transphobia is not something that exists in the heteronormative world out there, but is present in all of us. As the anxiety of the norm, as the revulsion of the trans body, or its evidence, as the fragile relation to our gender and that of our lovers. What we have here is a narrative of revulsion of trans bodies within a trans activist psyche. She takes it to the Transgender Film Festival, she brings it back to Bombay, and so on. I'm not suggesting that Z is a transphobe, but that she is haunted by perhaps her own history and overcoming of transness, one that leaves in its wake, to borrow from Christina Sharp, an ordinary transphobia. I'm suggesting that in our attempt to understand transphobia, we step away from the colonial creation of the criminal, built on racial profiling and other kinds of assorted myths, and instead think of the structural and ideological place transphobia has in making all lives livable, including the trans. It is precisely because to be trans is to be so close to murder that survival becomes a refusal to be trans. This we learn in our attempts to pass as that which we aren't, but also that which is made more desirable and livable in the world. It is what comes to haunt our love affairs, killing them before they could become love stories. What do you call it when you break your own heart? When you commit violence against the very name for which you struggle? When you are both the violator and the violated? When you fear, as Michael Warner would call it, your own planet? What I'm trying to say is that Jacqueline Rose, who's a famous psychoanalyst, gives us an idea of the word resistance. Now, resistance in a European context refers often to the resistance to the Nazi Germany, right? But resistance in psychoanalysis is that which blocks. Resistance in psychoanalysis is that which thoughts. It is what you resist in your speech. And the work of analysis is to open that passageway, right? So then, in some sense, psychic resistance can thwart political resistance. The trans person can resist the very norms with which they're trying to build worlds. The trans person, who should know more than anyone else what self-determination of gender is and why it is a necessary political freedom, may refuse it when it's near, intimate, and ready to kiss. Trans persons may know the phantasmical nature of all gender and yet not desire it. At the exact moment of recognition of trans identities globally, and their difficult lies even by the right wing regime in India, Zed's narrative asks that we pause to look at the subject of our politics. Rather, we undo both the subject and the politics. If the struggle is for recognition of trans persons, then any resistance must recognize their complex personhood. I borrowed this term from Avery Gordon, who kind of is thinking about Patricia Williams and Toni Morrison when she's writing this. If, on the other hand, the resistance is one to address the violence of the normative and the psychic states that oppress, exploit, and violate their vulnerability, then perhaps we might have to let go of the subject as the site of politics, or at least not hold to the subject to some fidelity as the only site of our politics. Third, Omar Mateen, Orlando. On June 12, 2016, Omar Mateen walked into Pulse, Orlando with an automatic rifle, killing 49 Latinx, queer, and trans persons of color. The club was holding a Latin night, so those who died belonged to a particular racial and ethnic history. Soon after the killings, news came that Omar had some relation to ISIS or was doing this to avenge the US's global war on terror, as well as rumors circulated that Omar was seen to have been haunting the club before or had even slept with some people in the club. What began as breaking news of the largest mass killing of trans, Latinx, and QTPOC persons soon turned into the story of internalized homophobia, right? Because that's the story that was being peddled, that he was seen at the club, he had mixed with and flirted with various trans people, and now he was killing them. So this kind of killing was seen to be an internalized transphobia that was being acted out. Omar's father, in response to speculations about his son's relation to ISIS, confessed to seeing Omar visibly disturbed on seeing two men kiss previous to the killings. Omar's religious identity, of course, couldn't just brush off the allegations, where Islam once again was pitched, including by then running presidential nominee Donald Trump, as an intolerant and murderous religion. When accused of plotting with him on the attack, Omar's wife had confessed that they had an abusive relationship. The FBI eventually concluded that no evidence was found of Omar on gay dating apps or ever having visited Pulse before. It was, the FBI seemed to convince us, religious intolerance. I am interested in the evidence of things not seen, to borrow a phrase from James Baldwin. There seems to be no evidence of Omar at Pulse before the fateful night, nor any digital footprint of him on cruising apps, gay cruising apps. And yet, Latinx QTPOC people remember his face at the club and testify to having had sex with him. It is also not surprising that the denial comes from the FBI, an organization interested in serving the United States state interest and white supremacy. That the FBI would front the narrative of religious intolerance at a time when the US is involved in a global war, whose primary victims are Islamic communities and Muslim folks, is not surprising. While the history of persecution and minoritization does leave me with a felt intuition to not trust the FBI in its conclusive narrative, I also find internalized homophobia as an insufficient placeholder to locate the violence. If Omar is actually seen at the club and has slept with the people who say they have slept with him, then his relation to sexuality, whether we are comfortable doing it or not, should be given the same kind of complexities that we would give to any other queer person. Many Latinx QTPOC folks were also outed by the media in the wake of these shootings. And yet we do not make those jubilantly dancing that night before Omar changed so much for them as suffering internalized homophobia. See, one set of people get to be inside the closet and given dignity, but Omar is not. The drama and silence around our sexuality and gender is never simply one thing, nor does it move from the closet to pride. We tuck lovers into bed and cover them with our silence. We let our hair down and avoid the cameras. We keep two social media accounts. We dance jubilantly and don't tell our parents. A more out life isn't necessarily the overcoming of shame, nor does conflict over our feelings and desire necessarily take us to depression and annihilation, let alone to murder. We seek many incommensurate and incompatible things in our lives. Perhaps both the desire of our many lovers and the approval of religious and parental authorities. Internalized homophobia in this story functions to close the conversation that the narratives of those who had seen and slept with Omar offer to us. Omar's passing between the home, the club, and the global then becomes a simple thing: internalized homophobia, religious intolerance. The overcoming authority of religion over everything else. Religion colonizes everything, like gender. It performs the very erasure that the murder exaggerates. It condemns another to the same unidimensionality that we are killed for. In some sense, it makes Omar into a suicide bomber. But I don't have the time to kind of think about that conversation here. Because suicide bombing is an act of the final intimacy with the enemy, right? You die together. And don't lovers do that as well? Okay. Given all the grandstanding by the United States officials in mourning these victims, I cannot also help but notice how their deaths eventually fell in line so well with the ideological project of the United States. The perfect crime. A minoritized and disposable community murdered by an ideological enemy that can further justify the ideological project and hegemony of the United States. So much so that even Donald Trump was found grieving. Trump, who when in power, would systematically roll back every welfare policy for trans persons. I doubt any of us took Trump's words seriously or sincerely, but we did hear his hatred of Omar's religious identity. The more and more we put together the various pieces and stories of Omar, the more we are taken away from the simple causality of his actions and easy solutions. We cannot generalize from even his spectacular murder of many Latinx and QTPOC folks what the shape of the transphobe finally is. In conclusion, we began with Venus, who wanted to be seen as a white woman and in passing as one was rewarded with survival. We find her murdered and we wonder who or what killed her. And while there are many reasons to believe that it was her gender, there might be some to believe that it wasn't. Gender isn't the only thing trans people do. If it is possible that trans persons find joy, have lovers, are full of the same emotional upheavals and everyday exhaustions that non-trans persons are, then we are left with less certainty of the causes of a death foretold. To refuse this possibility is to continue to totalize trans with gender, a life understood only in its abjection, thus performing the very abjection in our theory as the one that keeps us so close to our death. If everything is gender, and understood in its relation of congruity between the psyche and the body, then trans persons will be marginalized as the incongruity manifests. Perhaps the work of abolition is to suggest to look for a life where gender says there is none, and to sustain that. To trust the words of Venus when she claims she is a woman and a lover, and her little personal thing is her personal thing. It is possible that Venus lived as trans person but did not die as one, because there was a lot more to her. This mystery is part of the practice of freedom in difficult and threatening conditions. As Rita Dove, one of my favorite poets, writes, if you can't be free, be a mystery. When writing about transphobia, we tend to give weight to the perspective of those who commit the violence. This may be an unconscious act of empathy, but often we avoid the messiness of that gesture and satisfy ourselves with establishing causality, intention to murder. More worryingly, when writing to establish the violation, we often cause others. In Venus's case, We take the form of writing that is only interested in uncovering her secret. But it is only for the transphobe that Venus is, after all, her gender. Right? If trans is not just about the body and the mind, but also a matter of the heart, then Z, in the many twists and turns for her desire for K, offers us the difficulty of a trans person condemning another trans person to the scars of their body and little personal things. Love was made impossible for Z between K and her because both of them were trans. Whatever desire was tingling, shivering, quivering between them towards intimacy and relation, after K's history was discovered written on his body, was turned into a desire to flee into betrayal. Z's desire rejects the triumphalism of both her political activism and the closure of trans autobiographies. Instead, the only thing that stops us in our shoes to call this transphobia is the fact that Z is also trans. Perhaps it has triggered something in her own history, her own desires. Maybe she is haunted by it. Transphobia, as the incident between Z and K shows us, is less a condemnation and more a refusal of a pure subject of politics, of the burden of transgressive positions, of the stickiness of normativity that makes our lives and deaths as subjects. And I argue there is no reason to deny the same to Omar Mateen. The FBI wants to pass him as an intolerant Islamicist, but the rumors around his desires asks us that we do not let the state overwhelm all possibilities. The same state that maintains the precarity of Latinx and QTPOC folks that led them to be murdered that night and did not offer any protection. Complexity does not endow innocence, already a legal category. It merely resists totalitarian impulses. It refuses to empower the very state that doesn't care about Latinx QTPOC folks and their families, withdrawing welfare here, detaining them there, rendering them disposable here, making them cheap labor there, and so on and so forth. To the state, Omar's religious identity was more valuable than the lives of the trans people who died that day. And again, this doesn't let Omar off the hook, but we shouldn't let the state continue its exploitation. The state had already minoritized the people we had lost that night. The struggle against transphobia cannot focus on the exceptional moment of their death, but must focus on how the state has rendered their lives disposable. In condemning Omar for the murders, it doesn't make the rest of the QTPOC lives and Latinx folks more livable. To address death, we must speak with life. We must struggle for the stuff that makes life comfortable, joyous, less fearful. Medicare, Social Security, free housing, end to police violence, and so on and so forth. Abolition isn't about the checking of prison violence. It is about the institutions that replicate carceral logics and reasoning, forces that make lives about deserving and undeserving, mattering and not mattering. The structures that, without external force, convince of the need to pass in order to survive. Those, without laying it, make some love stories about the law like love. Those that make grieving possible only in the denial of our abundance. Jai Bhim, Hul Johar.